Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Deep Q Cast. You have your moderator-in-chief, Robert Ridzak, here with his two compatriots, Matthew Reed, which is looking extremely intelligent today with that white collar underneath his black
I'm already
sweater.
half a beer in because this took so long to get started today.
That's great. That's great. And, of course, Carlos Zendejas. Great to have you guys on the show again to chat.
Well, I don't get a fucking nice thing to say about me. I'm just here.
You're just here today. You're just here. I'll throw it in later. I'm keeping you on your toes.
I think you and my wife have been comparing notes. I'm just the guy who's here.
Actually, I texted her. I was like, how should I compliment Carlos today? What does he need?
Just don't
He's like,
compliment
nothing.
here.
Nothing.
Don't give that guy a big head.
That man has so much confidence. He doesn't need any of it. Cool, boys. Cool. How's it going today?
Going good.
It's been a week in crypto markets for sure. So I'd say that a little bit of Patriot water is well needed. That's for sure.
Patriot back at it with the Patriot water.
Yeah, man, it's like my first love. You can't get away for too long. I just can't quit you.
You try, but it comes back. What are you drinking over there, Matt?
It is Sloop. I've actually had their Pilsner. I'm not sure you can see that. Sloop Brewing. I've had their Pilsner before, which is great, and this is the Nelson Bum. It's actually really good.
What is a Nelson
It looks like a kiwi.
Exactly. And NEIPA.
That sounds like a wrestling move, like a Nelson bomb.
It does, doesn't it? It's just an Indian pale. It's pretty good. Really good.
Can you show the can again?
Supposed to go for a run after this, and I don't think that's going to happen.
Doesn't the bottom of the can look like a kiwi? It's like a kiwi.
It does. Yeah, it doesn't taste like kiwi, though. I can promise you.
No,
I would have spat it out by now, probably.
Really? I don't know. I've tried. Have you tried any of those? Like, hard ciders are coming back. They have you have Belgian ales, right? I mean, you put like an orange in there. I feel like those are coming. I guess they're more summery
like
drinks.
this white ales with a little bit of citrus in it.
Yeah,
absolutely perfect. My pandemic beer of choice was Einstock. They have a white ale with some orange and coriander. Fun story. That was the beer we drank when we conceived the idea of Deep Q Digital. So
yeah, great beer.
I guess that'll be the beer on tap when you guys form an office.
If we ever do.
Yeah, if you ever do. Or you just ship cases to your engineers,
That'll be part of the welcoming packet.
Yeah. But kiwi is a citrus too. Like I've never seen that's actually an interesting idea.
Well, there's a market for it. You should start a kiwi beer.
Kiwi beer? I like it. I'll sell it to kiwis.
Yeah.
Done. That's my next that's a good startup idea. Love it.
Yeah.
Boys.
Screw crypto.
Yeah.
What? Screw AI. All that's done.
Although it's not a very well-kept secret now, Rob. You just told it
all. All 12 people that listen to my podcast, our podcast.
No, we have more than 12 subscribers now, bro.
Just kidding.
We're hitting the big time.
Just kidding. Yeah, man, I'll figure out how to weave it into a Web3 something. You just got to add Web3 to the back of the name.
Web3 AI-driven kiwi beers.
Yeah. A16Z, you heard it here first.
Get into Rob's seed round at a valuation of $30 million.
You have exactly a $30 million pre-seed valuation.
Yeah, pre-seed. Yeah,
that's the idea. It's a multi-million-dollar idea. Beautiful. Speaking of multi-million-dollar ideas, Fed came in 25 basis points, 100% priced in. Seemed like, right? I guess not a multi-million-dollar idea.
Not just the Fed. I mean, all the central banks this week have been like ECB, UK as well, 50 bips, and then the Fed on point did the 25 as expected, 4.75%. It's happened. It's actually funny. Like we were obviously trading around that time. I mean, Carlos and I were joking when. So obviously the announcement came. We're like, okay. And then Powell kind of walks on stage and immediately everything shit the bed.
Yeah, no, Bitcoin dropped about like $100 just the minute
Oh
he fucking
boy, yeah,
walked on
just
stage.
for walking on the stage. He hadn't even opened his mouth at that point, which is pretty funny.
It's wild. It's wild, right? And then you have like amazing payroll numbers come in and the market sells off.
Yeah, I mean, there's, I think that the key with both of those events is that the first move the market makes is almost always the wrong move. Like, I think there's this game of greater fools. Like, everyone has it in their playbook. It's like, all right, well, if this happens, then this is what we do. And I'm not even joking. Like, I've seen this before. You'll have like a hedge fund, and they'll have their computer screens open, and they'll just be listening for the result. And they've got like a playbook written down that's sort of like, okay, if this happens, do this. I guarantee you that for both of those events, there's just some dude smashing a keyboard because that's what like they were told to do, with zero thought, zero nuance, zero understanding of what to do. It's just like, listen, I was told to sell 100 million of XYZ if this happened, and I fucking did it. So, you tell me what to do next. There's a lot of muppetry in the markets, is basically what I'm saying, and very few people take the time to like actually digest the information. You just kind of like see a bright object and you fucking smash the market.
Oh my god, yeah, dude, that's funny. It reminds me of my old Deutsche Bank days. It's I mean, when you're an analyst, something like, it's like, do this, okay.
That's actually one of like the dirty secrets of the market, is like how much of the market is people that know what they're doing versus how much of the market is warm bodies in seats that are painting by numbers. Because I know this because I've painted by numbers myself, where it's just like you're sitting in a desk and you realize, like, your boss tells you, okay, if this happens, do this. And you have no incentive to play outside the lines at all, right? Like, you're not going to be like, oh, well, I exercised some really good judgment and critical thinking, and so now I'm going to do this opposite
That's
thing.
not what we pay you to do.
No, it's like, listen, buddy, I don't care if you made money or not. I told you to do an exact thing, and you did that exact thing. And like, I think this is particularly true when you see things like, forced sell-offs in the market or whatever, where, there's probably some guy that works in, prime brokerage lending at an investment bank. And the minute some threshold gets done, they smash the market to get out of it. Like, they don't care. That's not their job. No. They don't care about anything. They're just like, all right, I was told to do a job. When that thing happened, I did exactly what I was supposed to do. Do not care if I caused a mass market sell-off. This is just my job. And then they go home and they smash a beer or two, and life is good.
Wow, I did not. That's an interesting angle. I was thinking about it more like with the sell-off. It's more just been like the inverse. I mean, so much is being driven by the Fed and their decision making, and a good jobs report means that there's more likely to be higher rates of delay in any type of pivot. So it would be risk off. Like, that's. But to your point too, it's like there's so many people out there that act off of pure instructions with like that are
So I used to have this saying with like one of my best friends, dear friend, gave me a fantastic leg up in my career. Like, he was the trader, I was the quant. Like, we were a tandem at like 2 or 3 jobs together. And I always used to tell him, listen, buddy, you get paid to think fast, and I get paid to think slow. And so it's not that he was a muppet or anything like that, but like oftentimes, like you actually don't have the luxury of sitting down and like really thinking about nuanced things when you're a trader. Like, a lot of the job is just reacting. And then, so yes, admittedly, it makes a good soundbite when I'm like, there's so much muppetry in the market, but also like some of these, and there totally is. And don't take that away. But even still, there are some smart guys that just like, they're like, listen, they kind of take the mantra of like, Texas handgun salesman, which is like, shoot them all and let God sort it out, because their job is to think very, very fast. And one of the reasons why I like this particular guy, and I thought he was brilliant, was that he understood that his job was to think fast. And then if 10 minutes later, I would call him and be like, yo, dude, punch the numbers. Actually, I think this is the thing that we should be doing. Then, we went with it. So like you need to have some degree of being able to like digest information quickly and react off of a headline. But I think just as valuable, it's really important to be able to then take a step back and say, okay, that was my initial response. I made that given the best information I had available to me, but now upon digesting this information a little bit better, this is my new view, and I'm going to update, my prior.
I guess does that kind of make? I mean, I haven't worked in capital markets for a very long time, but I remember you watch and there'd be news that would come out and things would move, and then it would almost like a check mark and kind of like revert almost afterwards. Like sometimes you'd see results come out and the market moves opposite to what you intuitively think, and then later it will revert more towards that at a later time. So maybe I guess that's kind of touches on what you're mentioning, Carlos.
No, for sure. And I mean, Matt can probably touch on this because he knows as well as anybody, but this is actually probably one of the most time-honored patterns that get followed time and time again. And it's probably one of the main reasons why mean reversion is such an important, feature in a lot of models, because people tend to overreact to news. And so, if your model isn't predicting the future or predicting the reaction to people, right, an even better thing to do is to respond to the market's overreaction of that data and make a lot of money on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also if you are going to put a play on with respect to a Fed announcement, you better be sure you have the position on before the announcement, to be honest, because immediately after, the liquidity is going to get very thin. And so you're going to pay an awful lot for it. And that's kind of, even if you then decide immediately you want to do the position, you'll pay a lot for it just because the liquidity is thin, which is why you see these big gaps up and down until people digest what it means.
Or like people will sit on the sidelines to digest it before they move in. So that's why it moves so much, is that there's just less market participants.
And the ones that are eager to do it will end up paying for it because there'll be such thin liquidity, they'll have to pay a lot for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think people reacting to that, it has kind of a very similar dynamic as like a goalie in international soccer. Because they've actually done the math on this where it's like on a penalty kick, the ball travels so quickly that the human brain does not actually have the ability to process based on what they're observing in real time. They just kind of have to guess. And so if you're a goalkeeper and you're trying to judge which direction to jump based on what you're seeing, you're already done. So you need to make up your mind beforehand what's likely going to happen and realize that you could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen. I know the World Cup just finished a couple of months ago, but just like watching some of those the free kicks happen, the penalty kicks in stoppage time. It's like you'll see some of the goalies launch in the air before the guy, or just as the guy is hitting the ball, the goalie is already in the air, flying towards one side.
Yeah, no, it's kind of insane.
I honestly.
But like that being said,
No, go ahead.
I'll go for it.
Oh, I was going to say, I just think the biggest thing people are trying to look for now is like preempting the next CPI number. So that's like the Valentine's Day. And then you've got the PCE again, the one we mentioned that last week, the one the Fed are kind of focused on end of Feb. Everything leading up to that now is going to be driving the market. And any little piece of news, like there was the ISM after the jobs numbers today, which actually looked pretty strong too, right? So you have this high employment, wage growth not that high, but you have high employment, and then you have an actually pretty strong industry in manufacturing and services to back that as well. So it's kind of like looking pretty good for the economy right now. I mean, Carlos called the recession's over the other week. I'm not 100% with that, but I definitely think it's all things are actually looking pretty good. So this CPI number, if it's down again, then the Fed really don't need to go past 25 for the next month, and that's already priced in at like 99%, 97% or something.
Yeah, well, I want to kind of digest that a little bit because obviously, like if we get down to it, like the FOMC, Fed did pretty much exactly what they thought they were going to do. Jerome Powell came out and was not nearly as hawkish as everyone thought he was going to be. And by the way, for the record, I stand corrected at being wrong, because in our prediction episode a month ago, I told everyone the thing to do was to just sit there when Jerome Powell opened his mouth, because he was going to get real fucking mean and short the market, and I would have lost a ton of money had we done that.
Well, I think he just said the same sort of thing as he has, though. He wasn't. Which was, when asked about it, he just said, we don't think it's done. We're still looking at 4% core. That's our number, and we think there's more to be done. So he wasn't like a dove, but he just was very on point, and I don't think he sent the market into panic this time.
Yes. I guess my question then is...
Because he came in at 25 as well, which, previously it was a 50 bit. So, coming in on 25 is like, okay, they are easing off as well.
Yeah. But then we get payroll today, and the market was expecting 188K jobs, and we ended at 517. So, my question is,
wild.
What the fuck happened there?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely not coming from tech.
Because we're seeing, and I think this is where the headline number, and this is just my personal opinion, we need to digest this a little bit further. But we saw the market sell off dramatically, and while we were trading, we were like, yeah, that's going to rally back, because that headline number is probably a little bit misleading. And I think the thing that I'm kind of mulling around is effectively, if you had people during the pandemic era that didn't want to work, they were getting lots of stimulus, and had record high savings and investment income, that they're like, yeah, we don't really need to work. And now you're kind of entering into a zone where suddenly you're shifting away from high tech jobs, and if the job growth is really coming from things like retail, services, and tourism, that really kind of indicates to me that maybe there's a bit of a consumer credit crunch, and people who previously weren't super excited to go out and work are now picking up extra jobs. They're now picking up a first or a second job that they previously otherwise wouldn't need in order to kind of cover rising expenditures. So the data will tell. There will surely be some sort of revisement. There's probably some seasonal effect in play as well. But that being said, there's some interesting data afoot when it comes to this sort of stuff.
I think, as you said, the hourly salary hasn't increased month on month. So it's whatever and the bulk of the jobs are, as you said, retail and stuff. So I don't really think these are going to push the inflation story a massive amount. And also, clearly, the job cuts from tech haven't also had an impact. I think some economists were thinking it's going to be all these high-paying salaries are going to go, and then people are going to stop spending it. That kind of crunch hasn't really happened either. So it's kind of just an equilibrium right now. It seems that way.
Yeah.
And really, just I wonder. The next thing is the 14th. That's the big play.
I need to check out what how consumer
your favorite
credit
day,
has
Rob?
looked like
Valentine's
recently.
Day. You love it.
Oh man, how'd you know? Are you sending me a box of chocolates like last year?
Listen, buddy.
Of course.
You're not the only one on this podcast to text the other one's wives. That's all I got to say. I got some intel on you, bro. I got all the dirt.
Yeah, it's getting feisty on the DQ cast today, everyone. Man, you joined today. You're in luck. Yeah. Oh my god. Yeah. Hopefully, just a box of chocolates. Thanks. White chocolate though, Carlos. Please. Thanks. I'm allergic to.
Oh, that's the worst chocolate. Are we even friends anymore?
I hope so. I think
that's a little hyperbole. We're always best buds.
What do you guys know? I was looking at some charts before about just consumer credit and how it went off the charts. There's been a balloon in credit card debt. I haven't seen recently what that looks like, but I thought it was interesting your comments around fact that people were either getting stimmy checks, they were able to do credit cards or whatever. Maybe interest rates were a little bit low. There were advertisements for zero interest that might have helped for some of that, and then some of that stuff is rolling off. It's like, okay, crap. Well, now I have to find another way to live. Do you know
I saw some reports that were saying that like the average credit card percentage interest rate was like 20%. So imagine that, like you are taking out credit card debt to fund your life at 20% interest. Like I personally don't think the American consumer is as well off as the headline numbers suggest, and I'm a personal believer that like this job increase really is more along the lines of like people realizing they have to go to work to make ends meet, more so than it is like a positive thing for the economy. So, I mean, to be honest, like if you've got an asset that you're trading that sold off today on those numbers, that's on sale. That's what I think.
Does the CPI, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, I should do some intellectual work. I could dig into this, but did it also show how, like, the difference between someone who already is employed and is looking for employment again, like maybe a second job or like just like, or like more employment? Do you know if it breaks that out?
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. That's actually something really interesting. I'll look into that. Cool, boys. Maybe boomers are just retiring a lot,
Well, that could also be, I mean, like the average baby boomer age is now 65. So, we are coming into this structural issue where, like it or not, we just have fewer workers in America. So that could also very well be, a thing that we're dealing with as well. So I think, in my mind, I personally am looking more at just straight up CPI. I'm looking at wage growth. But like headline numbers on jobs, I think can be a little misleading. And if you look at like the history of, non-farm payrolls or any jobs data, in some ways it can be a random number generator, and they are very, very, very prone to adjustments down the line.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it like, wages didn't change much, right? We have a lot of inflation. So, okay, if I'm not getting paid, I'm able to purchase less with what I have. So now I have to work. I have to work an extra 20% to have the same purchasing power that I did, 2 years ago, basically.
It's nuts. There's also, something fun to think about here, which I think is maybe a good topic for conversation. Imagine being the guy at the government agency that puts out these numbers, and you're putting out a model where because these are models, it's not like you legitimately have some dude or some sequence of dudes and dudettes who are tallying up the exact number of jobs. Like, this is legit. People are taking some data and they're putting together a model. And if the output of your model can evaporate billions of dollars in asset prices, that's got to be pretty high stakes. And so I think it's also worth noting here that, at the end of the day, what we're doing is we are taking a model that is output by some government agency, and everyone knows that government agencies can afford the best quants and the best technology, and we are taking that as gospel truth, and we are putting billions and billions and billions of dollars on the line as a result of it. So it's kind of interesting to think about that in terms of what that actually means for our economy, that we're so reliant on a model that's likely just a linear regression on someone's Excel spreadsheet at a government agency.
Yeah, I wonder if folks at Reed Dalio's fund, Bridgewater, they've built out their own quant metrics, actually get their own interpretation of what CPI actually is, and they probably make a relative value trade on it, right?
I'm sure they do.
It wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
There's hedge funds will pay to go and get people to measure the crop growth in certain areas so that they can get a foot ahead on like the futures market for where like, you can. There's a lot of.
I've got a really good friend who is a venture capitalist that they funded a company that used satellite imagery of oil tankers to determine how low the oil tanker was sitting on the water, so they could determine how much oil was en route in between in like shipping lanes. And hedge funds would buy this data so that they could trade oil on it. So it's like all these sorts of alternative data sets and all of these models that people build. It's huge business. And if you're thinking about it, like, and even, for example, informational advantages, like as a for instance, if you're watching the Fed, if you're watching Jerome Powell give a speech on Bloomberg, you also know that you're actually like 1.5 seconds behind live. So there are services that you can buy where they actually have a dude sitting there with like a live feed so that you can get the information a little bit early. And so I remember, in FX particularly, there would be quant funds and you would know what the reaction to the market was, because a half a second in advance of the actual statement, you'd see them smash the market in like 100 million, and like, oh shit, this is not a good number. And so you'd then, as a bank, you'd build a private alpha model and be like, okay, if this firm comes in and does this, they have advanced insight, and so get out of the way. So they were almost like the canary in the coal mine. You took their flow because you knew they were going to stuff you, but it would stop you from getting stuffed by everybody else.
See, like your comments around like the Fed and models, that's interesting, right? Because I know we've had a lot of talk about AI in the past. We're talking about ChatGPT and just like how people try to extrapolate information using financial models. And to me, this is totally outside of my wheelhouse, but it's just like, it's interesting. Like to your point, yeah, we rely so much on this data, but like, are these models actually accurate? Yeah. I mean, I guess it's like, it just makes me feel like I want to have like privatized metrics and not rely on the government as much.
I mean, ChatGPT is a good one. It's like, how did it actually arrive at its decision to give you that piece of text that you've seen on your screen, and can you trust it? Like, should you trust it? And I think that, to be honest, I think that's partly why some of the other, Alphabet, Amazon, a few other places have kind of had some of these generative models and just sat on them, not really wanting to put it out there in case it came up with something a bit crazy. Because they are black boxes at the end of the day. They're very hard to, you can't really say with any certainty like what drove the specific response that you got. You could try and infer it, but it's very, very difficult to tie back exactly what part of the training corpus of text it used to then give it the exact answer that it's giving you right now. And I think that kind of applies to not just text, it applies to anything where there's a high stakes decision at the end of it. Now, just getting a bit of text on the screen, maybe you think that's not high stakes, but the context of it could be racial hatred if you're not careful. It could be very biased information that only gives you the left or right wing response. So how do you like govern that kind of response? But then even with, and actually there've been tests that show that like ChatGPT is kind of left wing. It's kind of a bit more blue, which if you have an issue with that, then build another model for it, I guess. But yeah, it's really understanding how the model comes to its answer, I think, is key in what drove it to give that response. And that's really difficult to do in some models.
There's a super interesting thread on Twitter, Jan LeCun, who is the head of, he's like an OG in the world of, neural networks, like legitimately wrote the book on most of the cutting edge, bits of AI research that drive
they did convolutional nets first or something.
Yeah. And now he's over at Meta, and he had this text thread basically talking about how, ChatGPT was actually pretty easy to build, and none of the technology is new, and that companies like Meta and Google do that every single day. And so in my mind, there's a bit of like an interplay, which is OpenAI being cavalier by releasing, AI models that are unproven and perhaps risky, or are Google and Meta just being little bitches and, being like, guys, we could totally do this. Like, we have just as good models on our side. We've just chosen not to release them because we're afraid of the societal impact of our AI. I think I'm of two minds on that. I think it's interesting to see what will pop out. But with that being said, I'm kind of the mind of like, listen, guys, if you're so confident that your AI is better, why don't you release a product and show us? Until then, I'm just going to assume that OpenAI has a better product.
I have this image of like a 350-pound guy sitting in the outstands of a baseball park with his shirt off, drinking like a pitcher of beer, screaming at the batter, like, I could hit better than that. It's like, yeah.
Exactly. So much better. That's easy. Come on, man. Yeah, I mean, so who knows what it comes down to? But I do think, if we get away from the jokes, there is something really interesting, which is sort of like, in the world of AI, Matt used the term sort of like high stakes decision making. So, if you are, for example, let's say you're at Facebook and you're building this model that says, oh, what other Facebook accounts should I recommend to Matt as potential friend request ads? Well, like, that's pretty low stakes, right? If it recommends some like random asshole that Matt's never met before, he'll likely just scroll past that, and the societal impact of him, scrolling past that is nothing. Maybe like they'll forego a couple cents of like, ad revenue over the next couple years, and blah blah blah. And that certainly probably helps Facebook's bottom line, but it doesn't really negatively impact society. Versus, I guess on the other hand, you could say, well, what happens when you've got like content moderation where, you've got really important things like maybe election fraud that you want to look out for, or illegal or contraband things that are just generally accepted as being bad that you don't want on a social media network. Like, that's probably pretty important to eradicate as well. And then, you flip into the other world of sort of high stakes where maybe you've got a self-driving car. Well, what's the cost of the self-driving car hitting a pedestrian or getting into a car accident? Or in financial modeling, I think one of the things that scares a lot of people from using like a full AI financial model is, okay, cool. I've got this model that I know works and I can explain every portion of it, but maybe I get a slightly better, prediction value from this black box neural network. But if I put it into prod, it might cause financial Armageddon by overreacting and making me lose like $1 billion because there's some edge case that I haven't tested for. I would classify that as being, a high stakes model, in which case your cost of being wrong, even though small, you can be 99% accurate. But if that 1% of inaccuracy has a very, very, very high stake to it, then it might just be that you never, ever, ever have any incentive to put that model into production.
Yeah, like I remember, like to your point. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Matt.
No, go ahead.
I was just thinking, I remember I was looking at, I think I was listening to Elon Musk. I was talking about Tesla and some of these self-driving cars, and obviously there's been a lot of work done in automated driving. And the goal, I think to your point, like the goal of that is not to have a car that gets into accidents at par with a human driver. Like, it has to be orders of magnitude safer for us to get comfortable with it, because there is so much perceived downside for it to being wrong.
Yeah, and like one thing with that is pixel masking. So you have a self-driving car that takes a snapshot video of what it sees in front of it. Okay, now it's raining. What happens? You get blurring of the image. How does that impact the model underneath the hood, right? Does that now make you think, steer right or left? What does that do to what it thinks is in front of it? Does it just apply that? So there's a whole bunch of things that when you have a very big kind of or in that case, like a big visions, like a lot of pixels, a lot of models behind the scene, where changing one pixel can actually change like what it decides to do. That you kind of need to know why you're making the decision as well in the first place. And that's kind of what I was getting at, like high stakes, explainable models. I think are always going to be, depending on what the application is, it's pretty important that we always consider that, or at least know what you're giving up, and are able to test the scenarios well enough in order to make sure you've covered, as Carl said, covered that kind of state space of things that could possibly go wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly true when you think about, like for example, like financial models, right? So, if you're predicting the English language, or you're predicting, whether or not a picture looks like a dog or a cat, those are pretty static. But if you're going to like actually build a training model based on financial data, how many times does the FOMC release data throughout the year? So like if you were to try and, for example, build a model that says, okay, what do I do when the FOMC does this? Right, you're now dealing with a small handful of data points. You cannot build a model around that. And I think that I've often said that you need models to predict like the 90% of the time where things are just totally normal. And then you need people and traders to apply judgment on those edge cases. And so one of the critical things about being a trader for an algorithmic book that, trades some sort of strategy, I think anyway, is understanding exactly where the model falls short. Because otherwise you could be flying blind when certain edge cases happen. And so, like, if you don't know exactly when you need to step in and exercise judgment, it can become very difficult to not let the model get out of control. So I think that there's, finance definitely falls in the category of like a high stakes type of model where you could do lots of cool shit, but at the end of the day, you still need to exercise judgment. I think that's where a lot of like banks and hedge funds have always been a little bit reticent to sort of put in these nonlinear, cool, cutting edge models that technology has been very, very, very quick to adopt.
Yeah, and for instance, like I mentioned, like with a pixel, say a pixel gets broken in the camera, what does that do to the determinism of is it a cat or not? Can it still correctly identify? Same thing applies to like your financial data. Say if you drop a packet and you have this model that requires every single snapshot to have been captured, what does that do? Like so I think there's two pieces to it. Like you need really good data quality. Like the better, the highest quality data you can achieve is always the optimum to then train something that's black box. If garbage in, garbage out, exactly that scenario. But then also, if you don't understand why your model is making decisions, even it doesn't need to be a linear model. Like X times coefficient B gives me the gradient to predict like a linear regression.
Matt, I can sense that you're trying to dumb down linear models for people, but it's
people
still...
know what this is, don't they? Right?
Well, maybe our audience does. I'm just trying to be thoughtful of. You're like X, beta, and gradient.
Yeah.
Yeah, just simple stuff.
Right, like, come on, doesn't everybody have a PhD in particle physics like I do?
I mean, this
I thought that was a beer.
XB.
Gradient.
No, but yeah, a lot of there is some beauty to being able to say, this is how I got to the result. This is why I did the thing I'm doing. And there's various ways you can even do that with non-linear, but I think some approaches are quite happy to take the black box approach. And I think that's also fine as long as you have a well-tested system. But it does require very high data quality as a result if you're going to do that. And you need to test a lot bit more edge cases.
Isn't that kind of like a paradox? So you have like the more like you kind of like we talked about this before. Is like the more lines of code in something, the more chances that things can get massaged. So like simpler is better. But then if it's simple, doesn't it also then become harder to know where like the limits?
Well, I guess maybe we should explain like what's the difference with like a linear and a non-linear approach to start, because if you so the simple approach, say if you had a y equals x squared function, so like a parabola like this, a bowl shape. If you were trying to predict that with a linear model, you'd actually get a pretty good result. You could probably, you could get most of the direction right for at least, the positive half of it. And, maybe that's enough for what you need to do. But if you used a nonlinear model, you'd be able to actually really fit the curvature as well. And the question, and you could actually try to do this with a linear model if you transform the linear variable into take the log of it or something. But the problem with doing is that it requires a lot of feature engineering. So you have to manipulate, and that just reminds me of getting flagged on red flags if you say stuff like that. You have to or augment the data in such a way to then make it, you can use your linear model to fit something that is non-linear. And that requires a lot of skill, expertise, judgment. What's the right transformation? How do you interact crosses between different features? If you do multiple features at once. And a lot of the ML models kind of get around that because you just don't need to provide all of that. That's the whole point of them. They learn the non-linearities by default. They learn the shape of the data by default. So it makes life a lot easier, but then you tend to give up something which could be the fact that you had a very simplistic model, and now you have something that's maybe slightly harder to interpret back.
Yeah. I think about, remember Ron Burgundy, Anchorman?
How could I forget?
Right? Do you remember when they had they got him in trouble by putting the F-bomb on the teleprompter?
My favorite.
I feel like a linear model is Ron Burgundy, right? It gets paid to have salon quality hair and read the news. And if you put it on the teleprompter, it will say that exact thing, right? There's little nuance to it. It just says, okay, I observe this data, and I multiply that data by some coefficient, and then it gives me some output.
An F-bomb.
And there's very little nuance to it. And so, if you put fuck on the teleprompter, it will say fuck. And nonlinear model has the ability to understand the nuance in the data. So it was oh, actually, in this scenario, that's meant to be a nonverbal cue, and so I'm going to do the opposite and not say fuck on national television. But the problem is that you then give it some discretion, which you can't fully explain, right? When Ron Burgundy, Anchorman, sees something, it reads it, but exactly what you put on the teleprompter is going to come out of that person's mouth. And so that's significantly easier to explain to everybody because, if the regulator comes to you, you can just pull out the transcript of, your teleprompter and say, this is what we put on the teleprompter, this is what was read. And now life is perfect. But once you have a model that can exercise some judgment and go off script on those edge cases, it becomes a little more difficult. So I think a nonlinear model, outside of a mathematical construct, which Matt explained very beautifully, has the ability to understand nuance and basically say, there are some edge cases that I can fit to, and it's not a clear black and white rule, but it gives me some leeway to sort of estimate in certain gray areas what I should do. And that's beautiful because you want a model that can understand the nuances of what to do when given, non-standard things. Yeah. But it's also not something that you can point an exact finger to and be like, listen, this is exactly what we expected the model to do because there's a very easy function to track that allows us to understand what's happening.
This might be more of a philosophical question, but do you think in the trading world, underlying models and technology has gotten to a point where generally it will it will do at least as good of a job as a trained professional in the seat.
Yes.
But
1,000%.
Okay. And yet institutions are still hesitant to use that type of technology because if they are wrong, it sounds like it's worse. It's easier if it's a human error it's easier to explain. Is it easier to explain than if it's a modeling error? Like, will I just lose? Is there more job risk? Because if it's better, then they should just be using it all the time. There's like, even if there is some errors, it's okay.
I think
so. It sounds like what I'm trying to say is like, yeah.
I was going to say, I think one of the real risks, like in the financial world, because that's probably what the best experience with in this question, but it's ensuring, because you can just throw data at these types of models. That their job is to try and learn the structure of these data sets. And the key then is really just making sure you don't put things in that they shouldn't be aware of, that would then have a compliance issue attached to them. So a classic example would be front-running a client. If I built a model that got that I included, Carlos mentioned this earlier about having like private alpha. If a client came in on FOMC and knew something before you'd probably want to use that information to stop taking that kind of trade after they did whatever they needed to do with you. But the point is, after they've done that trade, so Carlos said explicitly, you get run over once and then you don't get run over again. If you're not smart or not careful, you could just include the minute they send the trade, you immediately include that in your model up front. And so that's part of the risk.
And then reject that trade.
Exactly, and then reject that risk and then maybe go and put on risk in that direction or something if it's like a hedge to hedge. And that is effectively, that's a bad scenario. And that's the compliance issue, is that if you're not careful, you could put data in that shouldn't be in there. And so that's kind of why I think people are somewhat reluctant as well. Not even people, just there is a little bit more reluctance in a heavily compliant space like finance.
It's not the tech, it's like the human error in the modeling is what they're worried about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and this is actually one of the things that I used to have conversations with my analysts all the time, is that, in the modeling world, you really need to understand what modeling assumptions you make, because oftentimes what ends up happening is that, the end consumer of a model doesn't know that 3 steps down the line in the research process, some researcher made some modeling assumption to simplify the data that then biases the model. So they don't understand that there are n number of subjective, bits of massaging of data and random things that go in there, and that could either include inclusion of data that is biased. It could be assumptions in how you prepare the data. It could be assumptions in how you train the model that are all subjective. But at the end of the day, what ends up happening is people who are consumers of that model take it as ground truth that this is just this purely objective model that is only trained on numbers, and that they forget all the underlying assumptions. So I had always caution people, if you're going to build a model, make sure that you clearly state all of your assumptions at the top of the model so people know what subjective bits are in it. And it just makes it cleaner for everybody else, because otherwise you'll have some hard-coded thing. And a classic example would be, for example, at Bank of America, they were especially worried about using AI in modeling, because they were like, all right, what happens if you give it models and that AI model learns, because you've given it biased data, that it should reject all minorities and people of color for credit cards. That's objectively a bad thing. And if you have a system that isn't very financially inclusive, and you give it non-financially inclusive data, and you're like, yeah, but that's just what the data tells us. The data tells us that minorities aren't worthy of credit. Well, then you get this self-propagating thing in the future, because people weren't upfront with the assumptions of the data that they put into the model, and that's generally a really bad thing. So we have this bias to assume that people are completely unbiased and quantitative when they build models, and that's just not the case.
How is this is coming from a layman who doesn't I think I used Python in business school, and I haven't touched it since. But how does someone who's a manager managing other people that are creating these models, how do you kind of ensure that some of that stuff the assumptions are listed as they are, that there isn't any, for lack of a better word, funky business going on?
I mean, it's kind of tough to. It depends what you're modeling. Like if it's client stuff, then I guess the example I mentioned earlier, don't use the client information and end up front running them or anything like that. So that's kind of like as a manager, would have to be sure that people understand the data they're getting and what its purpose is and what you cannot do with it. But yeah, I'm like generally I would say there's not that many restrictions, because say if it's say public order book data which everyone has access to, then you're kind of free to like massage it in whatever way you choose as the analyst. You get the data and then you can run whatever model you want, and that is like a public market data source. You just don't want to kind of introduce your own kind of look ahead bias. That would be the worst possible thing. So those are kind of the two keys. Yeah, and it really is to do with timing, like just making sure you're time compliant. I think that's probably the best way to to put it.
Yeah. I think so. For me, I think this is one of the things that I believe tech and buy side do better than banks, and that is, Rob. Let's say that you know nothing about your car, and you hear a little sputter in your car, and then you bring it to an auto body shop, and they walk out and they're like, "Cool. So here's the deal: the flux capacitor on your car is broken."
Yeah, that's what I mean. I had no idea.
It's a $3,000 part, but the most important thing is it's behind the widget doohickey, and we really need to deconstruct the entire engine to get this done. It's going to cost you $20,000 to fix. So will that be cash or credit? And I think that there are a lot of managers at banks that don't quite fully understand the way that a lot of models work. And I think that's changing over time as they put people who are better equipped to handle those things. But my experience at banks is that, there were a lot of people at very senior levels that didn't fully understand. And so it's kind of luck of the draw. Did you take your car to an honest auto body shop that just realizes you need to, fix a gasket and it's like a $10 part? Or do you take it to the place that tells you your flux capacitor is broken and it suddenly becomes like a multi-$1,000 ordeal? And if you don't understand how the models are created, you don't understand how the technology works, you don't understand the way that these things can be manipulated, you're kind of at the mercy of just random luck in terms of like, did you hire the right people and are they trustworthy and competent?
I guess
well,
it's probably... Go ahead, Matt, sorry.
I was going to say, like, for us, it's a bit tough because we're in the weeds of the models as well. So, like, we know what they should be doing, and really that it's the data augmentation that you as a manager want to make sure that piece is done right. After that, if you're happy with the data set, go nuts, try whatever you want, whatever you think will give you the biggest yield in terms of performance. And that then is a bit less of a question, because once you have a data set that you're willing to sign off on as this is appropriate, and there's no look ahead biases, maybe it doesn't have all the things you possibly want in it, but it's a good enough starting point and it doesn't do anything compliant wise that you have an issue with, then to be fair, you can run whatever model you're interested in. And I say that loosely because a model is really just fitting some data to some target in this scenario that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think this is actually kind of a new and an interesting thing in finance, because if you think of the history of electronic trading, a lot of the legacy infrastructure was built for this concept of the trader's brain is the end all be all. And what we need to automate is the behind the scenes bits. So like most trading systems at banks that were built in the 90s and early 2000s were basically along the concept of, all right, let's take what the trader does and then let's automate that and let's just make it faster.
Yeah.
And the market's now morphed. The market's now morphed in the same way that like when 90% of all cars will be self-driving, it will actually be dangerous to be a human driving a car in a world where all of the other cars are collaborating in real time and thinking at speeds that you can't think at. I think the market's already at that point. So then you get to this next evolution of the market where you're like, okay, well, you actually need a model to do pretty much everything. But all these legacy systems were built from the concept of like, okay, the trader runs the show, and we're just going to have a bunch of GUIs and toggles and various controls that automate what the trader does. And I think the next generation of trading systems are going to eliminate traders as a source of input and mostly have them be quality control. And then all the other components will be model driven. But, and here's the difficult thing, at least this is my view, most of those systems weren't built for data and AI to be a part of the core system. So everything becomes bolt on. You sort of have to say after the fact, how do I augment this system? It's really meant to be, a car. And that's driven by a person and put in AI. So it would be like if you were trying to create an AI car by attaching little levers to the wheel and then moving the wheel, right? It's an AI doesn't need to move the wheel or press the gas pedal. It can take control at a deeper level. So you don't even need a steering wheel at all.
I love that analogy. I can actually picture just a bunch of gimmicks and stuff on the car, and then something. It's so funny.
Well, it's actually there's a fun
analogy.
story. One of the first electronic trading bits was called the Clackatron. There's at Lehman Brothers, and it was in FX markets. They had these little terminals for Reuters where you could punch in your trades and have it go through the Reuters terminal, and they didn't have an API for it. And Lehman Brothers realized that there were all these arbitrages they could do, but a human couldn't type them fast enough. So they created a robot, I shit you not, that was on top of a Reuters terminal, and it was called the Clackatron because it was just a bunch of levers that were hammering away at shit and punching in trades. And they realized, oh, actually, hold on, we don't need to have this monstrosity of a Clackatron punching away on a keyboard. We can just provide an API and the computer can do it naturally. So there's actually a bit of a nuance in modern trading architecture where you're saying, okay, how do I get rid of this concept of a trader needing to intervene all the time and just make it purely model driven? And as Matt said, the difficulty in that is making sure that your data is pristine and that you build in this natural feedback loop that allows you to take data, put it through a model, and ingest that in real time and have a learning feedback loop. Which most legacy trading infrastructure just doesn't have because it was built back in the day for a different paradigm of trading.
That's so interesting. It's so interesting to hear. I didn't know that there was such a thing as a Clackatron. That's so funny to see here, how that integrates. It becomes more and more integrated. I guess banks have a lot of work cut out for them on an IT perspective. They want to try to keep up.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, it's not they're not these monolithic, terrible monstrosities. They do spend a lot on IT, but I think that because they're so hamstrung by regulatory technology and all the things that they need to do to kind of keep up with business as usual, they just can't innovate fast enough. So I think there's definitely an opportunity if you're not a bank to build really innovative stuff. That it's not that the people at Bank of America and JP Morgan aren't smart enough to do it, because there's certainly really smart people there. It's just that they've got bigger fish to fry. They've got the SEC calling them every other day, asking them for random stuff, and so all of their technology allotment is really okay, how do we do better discovery for all these regulatory filings that we do, and not how do we build better models that help us in our core business of making money.
Yeah. That's all. And you guys are gonna have an interesting session, aren't you? A little bit, to dig into this in a little more detail.
Yeah. So we're next time you speak to us, we're gonna have our first guest on the podcast. Yeah. A friend of the podcast who has built out a lot of these trading systems, both in crypto and in TradFi. And he's going to give us some insights in terms of how to build out trading systems where AI is a first-class citizen. So it should be kind of fun, especially if you're a geek and you want to learn about this shit.
That sounds fantastic. I mean, I feel like that's at least three of us here. Sure. Nerd out crypto macro trading. That's Deep Q Digital and Deep Q Cast in a nutshell.
Yes, sir.
It's awesome. Guys, Appreciate you coming on today.
Thanks,
always
guys.
a pleasure.
Catch up soon.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to it.
Peace.